By the autumn of 1941, Germany had assembled the largest single offensive force in the history of warfare and pointed it directly at Moscow. Operation Typhoon rolled forward with roughly 1 million men and 1,700 tanks, and the Wehrmacht's generals had every reason to believe the Soviet capital would fall before winter arrived. Two entire Soviet armies, 500,000 men, had already been encircled at Bryansk and Vyazma, swallowed whole before they could retreat. The road to Moscow was open. Soviet command was in crisis. And somewhere along the collapsing front, Stalin made a phone call. The man he called had spent the previous 2 years doing something no Soviet commander had yet managed to do. He had found an enemy on an open battlefield, read the terrain faster than that enemy could react, hidden an entire offensive force in plain sight, and then closed a trap so complete that the encircled division never fought again. The Germans did not yet know his name the way they would come to know it, but they were about to. His name was Georgy Zhukov, and the question worth asking is not whether he was talented. The question is what exactly he saw that everyone else around him kept missing. To understand the answer, you have to go back to the steppe, not to the Soviet Union, but to Mongolia in the summer of 1939. The border between Soviet-aligned Mongolia and Japanese-controlled Manchukuo runs across flat, open grassland near the Khalkhin River. There are no mountains here, no forests, no natural defensive anchors, just dust and sky and empty ground stretching in every direction. Japan's 23rd Division had been pushing Soviet and Mongolian forces steadily westward, and the clashes had been escalating for months. Tokyo expected the situation to stay manageable. Japan had been fighting in China, testing Soviet patience along the Manchurian border, and the general assumption was that Moscow would respond the way it always had. Infantry up front, tanks parceled out in support, a conventional defense built around holding the river line. Zhukov arrived, looked at the terrain, and saw something different. Every other commander looked at the flat steppe and saw a problem. No cover, no natural defense, nothing to anchor a line. Zhukov looked at the same ground and saw a corridor. The same open plain that offered no protection also offered no obstacles. Armor could move in any direction without restriction. The flanks of any force positioned in the center were completely exposed, and Japan's 23rd Division, confident in its infantry strength and the predictability of the Soviet response, had positioned itself exactly where its flanks could be reached. The request Zhukov made next was not standard Soviet doctrine. He did not ask for more infantry. He asked for independent armored strike groups, tank formations that would operate on their own, not as infantry escorts, but as deep flanking weapons. It was a fundamental departure from how the Red Army used armor in 1939, and it told you everything about how Zhukov read a battlefield. He was not trying to solve the problem in front of him. He was building a different problem for the enemy to discover. What followed was one of the most carefully constructed deceptions of the pre-war period. Over several weeks, Zhukov quietly moved 550 aircraft, motorized brigades, and BT-7 tanks into position. The transfers happened at night. Truck engines were run alongside the tank columns specifically to mask the sound of the armor. Radio traffic remained flat and routine. Fake communications suggested no significant Soviet buildup was underway. Japanese intelligence saw a quiet front, a force apparently not reinforcing aggressively, a Soviet commander apparently preparing the same static response Japan had always expected. What Japanese intelligence could not see were the two armored wings forming on the northern and southern edges of the front, one pushing up above the 23rd Division's exposed right flank, one gathering below its left. On the morning of August 20th, 1939, Zhukov struck on all axes simultaneously. Soviet aircraft hit Japanese airfields in the first wave, grounding the air response before it could organize. Then both armored columns drove hard along the flanks, not probing, not feeling for weakness, but sweeping at full speed toward the rear of the Japanese position. The 23rd Division's infantry center was strong. Zhukov had never intended to hit it. The strength in the middle was irrelevant once the flanks collapsed. Within 5 days, both Soviet armored wings had linked up behind the encircled Japanese force. The 23rd Division was surrounded, cut off from supply, and annihilated. The false center had worked exactly as designed. Japan had reinforced and prepared the part of the battlefield that was never going to be the decisive point. The real danger had moved around the outside of that strength and closed behind it before any effective response was possible. The strategic consequence extended far beyond one encircled division. Japan spent the following months reassessing Soviet military capability. The flat-step engagement that Tokyo had expected to be a manageable border clash had instead produced a complete operational defeat. When Japan's strategic planners debated whether to push north into Siberia or expand south toward the Pacific, the memory of the Khalkhin River played a role that historians still debate in precise terms. But what is clear is that Japan never launched a major offensive against the Soviet Union again. The decision to strike south toward Pearl Harbor and Southeast Asia kept millions of Soviet troops on the Western Front instead of tied down defending Siberia. Zhukov returned from Mongolia with a battlefield reputation and a lesson confirmed. The enemy's assumption about where the blow was coming was the most powerful weapon available. Exploit the assumption before the enemy has time to question it. 2 years later, that lesson would be needed on a scale Mongolia could never have prepared him for. By early October 1941, the situation in front of Moscow was not bad. It was catastrophic. The Bryansk and Vyazma encirclements had torn 2 Soviet armies out of the defensive line. 500,000 men gone. The road network west of Moscow lay virtually undefended, and German Army Group Center was driving east with a force that had not yet been seriously checked. Wehrmacht officers had been known to look through binoculars and believed they could see Moscow's outer districts. The Soviet capital housed millions of civilians and every major organ of Soviet government and industry. Its fall would not simply be a territorial loss. It would reshape the entire war. Stalin placed Zhukov in command on October 10th. What Zhukov did not do is as instructive as what he did. He did not try to rebuild the line that had just collapsed. That line no longer existed. Instead, he started building a new one, closer to the city, deeper, harder, more deliberately positioned. Soviet civilians were mobilized to dig anti-tank ditches and earthworks on a scale that had no modern precedent. Over 3 million cubic meters of fortifications were constructed around Moscow's perimeter. Factories inside the city shifted to arms production. The city was not simply being defended, it was being converted into a defensive system. Meanwhile, from the east, Siberian divisions began arriving at the front. These were not reinforcements in the conventional sense. They were soldiers who had trained and lived in extreme cold, acclimatized to temperatures that would stop a European army in its tracks. Their equipment functioned in winter conditions. Their bodies had adapted to the environment. Zhukov was not waiting for the Germans to attack. He was waiting for the Germans to exhaust themselves against the new line, and for the Russian winter to do the work no defensive position alone could accomplish. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Supply lines that had stretched across hundreds of kilometers began to freeze and fail. Lubricants seized in tank engines. Soldiers without adequate winter gear suffered frostbite casualties that, by the most conservative documented estimates, exceeded 100,000 men. The momentum that had carried the Wehrmacht from the Soviet border to the edge of Moscow had spent itself against the fortifications, the terrain, and the cold. German commanders at the front were reporting to headquarters that the offensive could not continue. That was the moment Zhukov had been constructing since October. On December 5th, 1941, Soviet forces launched a full counteroffensive along the Moscow front. Fresh Siberian divisions struck an army that had fought itself to the edge of collapse. The Germans had no reserves positioned to absorb the blow. Their supply lines were already broken in places, their formations under strength, their equipment barely functional. The counteroffensive drove the Wehrmacht back over 250 kilometers from Moscow's perimeter. It was the first major German retreat of the entire war. The psychological and strategic weight of that retreat went far beyond the ground recovered. Germany had built its entire military reputation on the idea that its armies did not go backward. That reputation cracked in the snow west of Moscow. The war, which German planners had expected to end in weeks, had now revealed itself as something altogether different. A contest of depth, endurance, and industrial capacity that Germany had never been prepared to fight. But Zhukov was already planning the move that would make everything before it looked like preparation. By the late summer of 1942, Germany's 6th Army had driven deep into Stalingrad and was grinding through the city block by block, building by building, floor by floor. By September, German forces controlled approximately 90% of the city. The fighting inside Stalingrad was unlike anything seen on the Eastern Front: close, brutal, consuming enormous quantities of men and material to gain a single ruined factory or a stretch of rubbled street. German commanders reported progress. They believed the city would fall. They kept reinforcing the urban fight. That fixation on the city was exactly what Zhukov needed. While Germany poured its best army into the interior of Stalingrad, Soviet planners, Zhukov and Chief of the General Staff Vasilevsky working together, with the precise division of credit between them still debated by historians, were assembling something outside the city that the Germans had not detected. 5 complete Soviet armies took shape over months behind the front lines, north and south of Stalingrad. The 1st Guards, 5th Tank, 21st, 51st, and 57th. The entire buildup operated under strict maskirovka, the Soviet doctrine of military deception. Units moved only at night. Radio silence was enforced completely. Fake transmissions maintained the impression of routine activity. The real forces were hidden behind terrain, in positions where German reconnaissance had no reason to look because German attention was locked on the city. What German intelligence had also failed to fully account for were the flanks. North and south of Stalingrad, stretching out from the city along the Don River bend and across the open steppe to the south, the German line was held not by German formations, but by Romanian armies, Allied forces that were less well-equipped, less experienced in mobile warfare, and thinly spread across long stretches of exposed ground. The Germans had placed their best forces inside the city they were trying to capture. The outer flanks, the long approaches from the north and south, had been left to allies whose defensive capacity was a fraction of the 6th Army's. The front seemed frozen. Inside the city, the fighting raged, but behind the Soviet lines, everything was moving into place. On November 19, 1942, the artillery opened before dawn north of Stalingrad. Soviet forces from the northern grouping, the 5th Tank Army and 21st Army among them, smashed into the Romanian 3rd Army's positions and broke through within hours. The following morning, the southern grouping struck from across the open steppe below the city, hitting the Romanian 4th Army with the same result. Both Romanian formations collapsed under the weight of the assault. The flanks that had been left exposed were now open roads. The two Soviet pincers drove hard toward each other, not toward Stalingrad itself, but west of it, aiming for the Don crossings, the supply roads, the single corridor through which the 6th Army received everything it needed to fight. On November 23rd, the northern and southern columns linked up at the town of Khalkhin. 4 days after the offensive began, the encirclement was complete. 250,000 men of Germany's 6th Army were surrounded inside a shrinking pocket, cut off from supply, cut off from reinforcement, with no route of escape. The bait city had closed. Germany had sent its most capable army to take Stalingrad, and in doing so had thinned the flanks to nothing, had fixed its attention entirely on the wrong objective, and had walked its best formation into an encirclement it never saw forming. Soviet artillery worked the pocket down through December and into January. On February 2nd, 1943, the last surviving elements of the 6th Army surrendered. The German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front was finished. It would never be recovered. 3 battles. 3 traps built on the same logic. At Khalkhin Gol, Zhukov let the enemy assume he would fight in the center, then swept both flanks simultaneously, with armor the enemy did not know was there. At Moscow, he let the German offensive exhaust itself against fortifications in winter while fresh forces waited, then struck the moment the enemy had nothing left. At Stalingrad, he let Germany pour its strength into a city, while 5 hidden armies formed outside it, then closed a pocket around an enemy that never looked up from the street fight long enough to see the danger forming in the open ground beyond. The enemy was never stupid. The Japanese 23rd Division was a capable formation. The Wehrmacht was the most tactically sophisticated army in the world. The 6th Army contained some of Germany's finest soldiers. What they all had in common was that they had looked at the visible battle and assumed that was the real one. Zhukov built the real battle somewhere else. He would go on to command the final Soviet assault on Berlin in 1945, closing the largest encirclement of the war around the German capital itself. The pattern held to the end. The enemy believed the decisive point was one place. The decision was already being made somewhere else.